The morning Seth Rhodes found the initials carved into the bark of his cottonwood tree. He stood so still for so long that the mockingbird perched above him grew tired of waiting and flew away. It was the autumn of 1873, and the Texas Panhandle was painting itself in shades of amber and rust, the way it always did when October settled in like an old friend who knew better than to overstay its welcome. Seth had been up since before dawn, the way he always was, walking the perimeter of his land with a tin cup of black coffee steaming in his left hand and nothing in his right except the habit of reaching for things that were not there. He had 160 acres, homesteaded legally under the Homestead Act, proved up and paid for with 3 years of his own blood and sweat, and a few ugly winters that had tried their level best to break him. The land was good. Not easy, but good. And the cottonwood at the eastern edge of his property was the first thing he had planted when he arrived, barely 22 years old and certain of very little, except that he needed something living to mark the spot where he intended to stay. He had planted that tree in the spring of 1868, when the sapling was hardly taller than his boot. He had carried it in a flour sack from the town of Haskell, 3 days east, and he had dug the hole himself and placed it carefully in the Texas soil, and watered it from a bucket until the rain started doing the job for him. 5 years later it stood as tall as he did, maybe taller, with bark that had grown rough and grooved in the way cottonwoods do, the kind of bark that catches things, that holds on to them. He was looking at the tree, now the way he had looked at it 100 times before, just checking on it the way a man checks on something he has invested a piece of himself in. The sun was still low and orange in the east, throwing long shadows across the dry grass, and the light hit the eastern face of the trunk at just the right angle to make the carvings visible. EA, 2 letters, clean and deliberate with a small heart drawn around them, not recent work. The bark had grown around the edges of the cuts, softening them, pulling them inward the way living wood does over time. These letters had been carved years ago, maybe 5, maybe 6 years back, maybe longer. Seth set his coffee cup down in the grass and pressed his fingers against the grooves. He had never carved anything into this tree. He had never given anyone permission to do so. And the deeper problem, the one that made the hair rise on the back of his neck, was that this land had been his and his alone since the day he claimed it. No one else had lived here. No woman had ever stood at the base of this tree with a knife in her hand. And yet, he straightened up and looked out across his land, across the flat stretch of grass and scrub cedar, and the low dip where his creek ran shallow in the dry season. The morning was quiet. Just the wind moving through the grass and the distant sound of his horses shifting in the corral. He did not know anyone with those initials. He turned the letters over in his mind the way you turn a coin, looking for a face you recognize. Nobody came to mind. He pulled his hat down tighter against the morning breeze and walked back to the house, and he could not stop thinking about those 2 letters the whole rest of the day. Seth Rhodes was 27 years old and had no wife, no children, and no particular loneliness about either of those facts. He had his horses and his cattle, a small but respectable herd he was building year by year. He had his friend and nearest neighbor Gideon Hall, who ran the next homestead 2 miles north. He had his dog, a big brindle hound named Custer, who had been given the name ironically the year before by Gideon, who had a dark sense of humor. Seth had kept the name because the dog seemed to like it. He had the town of Cowboy Creek, 4 miles to the southwest, where he went for supplies once a week and occasionally for a drink at the Dusty Nail Saloon, though he was not a drinking man by strong habit. He had a life, a quiet one, a good one, and he had a mystery carved into his cottonwood tree that he could not explain. He asked Gideon about it the following Saturday when they rode into Cowboy Creek together, their horses walking easy in the mild October afternoon. Gideon was 30 years old and had the kind of weathered face that made him look 40, with a wide jaw and dark eyes and a beard that never quite became a real beard, just a permanent suggestion of one. He listened to Seth describe the carvings and then squinted off at the horizon in the way he had when he was thinking. "EA," Gideon said. "You sure you did not put it there yourself and forget about it?" "Gideon, I have never once carved anything into that tree in 5 years." Could have been someone passing through, trail hands maybe, someone sheltered near the creek and marked the tree. A trail hand carving a heart around a set of initials. Gideon was quiet for a moment. "Fair point," he admitted. "That does seem unlikely. The bark has grown around it," Seth said. "Those letters are old. So someone was on your land before you claimed it and carved their initials into a sapling you later planted." "I planted that tree myself, Gideon. I dug the hole and placed the sapling. There was nothing there before." Gideon scratched the side of his jaw. "Well then," he said, and offered nothing further because there was nothing further to offer. Callaway Creek was a town of roughly 400 people in 1873, which meant it had a general store, a blacksmith, a post office that was also the telegraph office, a barber, a schoolhouse that doubled as a church on Sundays, 2 saloons of which the Dusty Nail was the more reputable, a small hotel called the Callaway House, and a doctor who went by Doc Perkins and who was equally capable of setting a broken leg and pulling a tooth, and had been known to do both in the same afternoon without flinching. It was not a big town, but it was a functioning one, the kind of place that felt permanent even if nothing in the Texas Panhandle could truly promise permanence. Seth collected his mail and his supplies and did not learn anything more about EA that day. He tried to put the mystery out of his mind over the following weeks and largely succeeded, the way a man succeeds in not thinking about something by thinking about it only twice a day instead of constantly. October turned to November, and the first cold fronts came down from the north with a sharp edge that reminded everyone how fast things could change out here. Seth mended fences and cut and stacked firewood and rode out to check on his cattle, and came home in the evenings to a quiet house and a fire and Custer sleeping by the hearth. It was the first week of November when the wagon arrived in Callaway Creek. Seth was at the general store when it came in, loading sacks of cornmeal into his wagon while old Frank Beal, who ran the store, talked at him about the dry spell and what it was doing to the grazing. Seth was only half listening because he was doing the arithmetic of his supplies in his head, which was the kind of practical mathematics that kept a man solvent on the frontier. He heard the wagon before he saw it, the sound of a team coming in tired, the way horses sound when they have been pulling hard for too long. He turned and saw a single covered wagon, not a particularly grand one, with 2 bay horses and a driver who was a woman sitting alone on the bench. That alone was enough to stop the conversation in the street for a few seconds, the way unexpected things always did. A woman driving alone was not unheard of, but it was uncommon enough to draw attention, and the woman doing the driving seemed either unaware of the attention or unbothered by it, holding her reins with an ease that suggested she knew exactly what she was doing. She brought the wagon to a stop in front of the general store and climbed down from the bench with the kind of movement that is efficient rather than graceful, not bothering with delicacy, just getting herself from the seat to the ground in the simplest possible way. She was young, Seth thought, though the trail dust on her made it hard to say exactly. Medium height, brown hair tucked up under a wide-brimmed hat that had seen better days. A dark green dress that was practical and dusty, and a pair of boots that looked like they had covered a lot of miles. She looked around the street with dark eyes that were taking in everything, cataloging it, deciding things. Then she looked directly at Seth. "Is this Callaway Creek?" she asked. "It is," Seth said. "Is there a land office here?" "Post office handles land business, just around the corner." She nodded once, the way people nod when they have been given information they were already half expecting. "Thank you," she said, and turned and walked in the direction he had indicated without another word. Seth watched her go and then turned back to his wagon and finished loading his supplies. Frank Beal had appeared in the doorway of the store with his thumbs in his suspenders, and was watching the street with the bright, interested expression of a man who collects other people's business. "That there is a woman alone," Frank said with the gravity of a pronouncement. "Yes, it is," Seth agreed. "Wonder where she's headed. Probably wherever her claim is if she's looking for the land office." Frank made a sound that was skeptical. "Women don't usually homestead alone." "The law does not say they cannot," Seth said, and climbed up onto his wagon seat. He did not know why he felt the urge to defend a woman he had spoken 12 words to, but he felt it, and he drove away before Frank could speculate further. He learned her name 3 days later, not because he had gone looking for it, but because Callaway Creek was the size it was, and information traveled the way everything travels in a small place, which is to say by the indirect route of everyone passing through Gideon Hall. Gideon appeared at Seth's gate on a Thursday morning looking like he had news, and did not particularly know what to do with it. "The woman who came in on the wagon Monday," Gideon said. "Her name is Ellen Atwood. She is 23 years old, from Missouri. She has a brother who filed a homestead claim 6 months ago and died of fever before he could prove it up. The claim reverts to her as next of kin, and she has come to take it up herself." "How do you know all of that?" Seth asked. "Clara Perkins told me, Doc Perkins' wife. Ellen Atwood came to see about boarding at the Callaway house, and Clara was there having tea with Margaret Holloway, who runs it, and Clara has ears like a barn cat." "Where is the claim?" Gideon paused. He looked at Seth with an expression that Seth did not immediately understand. "Eastern edge of Callaway Creek land," he said. "Creekside quarter section." Seth was quiet for a moment. "That borders my land." "Yes," Gideon said, "it does due east of you." Seth looked out at the flat horizon and thought about the cottonwood tree that stood at the eastern edge of his property, at the border of what was now apparently Ellen Atwood's land. His heart did something odd and uncomfortable in his chest, something that was less like a heartbeat and more like a stumble. "Gideon," he said. "I know," Gideon said. "I know," Gideon said again, and his voice had gone soft in the way it did when he was taking something seriously. Seth rode out to his cottonwood tree that afternoon and stood before it for a long time in the pale November light. The leaves had all gone golden and were dropping steadily in the cold breeze, collecting around the base of the trunk. He looked at the carved letters at the bark grown around them, and he tried to think about it logically the way his nature generally demanded. Ellen Atwood had been in Missouri. She had not been on this land. She could not have carved these initials. And yet, her brother. If the brother had come through the Texas panhandle before filing his claim, perhaps he had stopped at the creek. Perhaps he had sheltered there. Perhaps he had a sister named Ellen whose initials were EA and whose name he had carved into a sapling for reasons only he would ever know. It was a logical explanation. It made sense. Seth held on to it firmly. But something quieter than logic said to him, standing in the cold wind with his hand pressed against those carved letters, that some things do not need to be explained in order to mean something. He decided he would go and introduce himself to his new neighbor. It was the neighborly thing to do, and had nothing to do with carved initials or the fact that somewhere in the back of his chest, something was turning over like a new engine warming up. Ellen Atwood was staying at the Callaway house while she prepared to move out to her claim, and he caught her at the general store on the following Saturday when she was buying supplies. She was in the same practical clothing, cleaner now, and she had her hat off, and he could see her properly for the first time. She was not what anyone would call classically beautiful in the way that magazine illustrations might depict, but she had the kind of face that held your attention, that you found yourself looking at, and then realizing you had been looking at it for longer than was strictly polite. Her eyes were dark brown, almost black, and they moved quickly, catching things. She had a straight nose and a firm chin and a mouth that seemed built for plain speaking rather than soft words, though he would later learn it was built for both. "Miss Atwood," he said, approaching her with his hat in his hands in the way his mother had taught him. She turned and looked at him without surprise, as if she had been expecting someone to speak to her and had merely been waiting to see who it would be. "You are the man from Monday," she said. "The one who pointed me toward the post office." "Seth Rhodes," he said. "I have the claim due west of yours along the creek." She studied him for a moment. He was aware of the study the way you are aware of sunlight on your face, present and warm and slightly exposing. "You know about my claim." "Small town," he said. "I am sorry about your brother." Something shifted in her expression, a tightening around the eyes that was grief trying to be practical. "Thank you," she said. "James was a good man. He chose good land." "He did," Seth agreed and meant it. The creekside quarter section was excellent land, with water access and good grass and a rise at the western edge that would make a solid building site. "Have you been out to see it yet?" "I am going tomorrow," she said. "I have the survey documents. I just need to understand what I am working with before I commit to moving out there." "The house is not much," Seth said. Your brother had only begun. He had ridden by it once, just to orient himself to his new neighbor's situation. There was a small dugout structure and the beginnings of what might have become a proper cabin, but James Atwood had died in his 6th month, and the evidence was that he had been alone and working hard and had not gotten very far. "I would be glad to ride out with you if that would be useful. I know that part of the land well. The creek runs year-round there, even in the dry season." She looked at him again with those quick dark eyes, and he had the distinct impression that she was deciding something. "All right," she said finally. "I appreciate that, Mr. Rhodes. Tomorrow morning." "I will be at the Calloway house at 8, he said. He went home and told Custer about it, which was his custom when he had news and no one reasonable to tell. Custer listened with his ears up and his head tilted, which was about as much as anyone could ask. The morning was cold and bright, one of those November days that the Texas Panhandle offered as an apology for the brutal ones. All clear sky and thin gold light and air that was sharp and clean in the lungs. Seth arrived at the Calloway house at 8 o'clock with 2 horses, his own chestnut gelding Ranger and a calm bay mare named Penny who belonged to Gideon, and who Gideon had lent without being asked, which was the kind of friend Gideon was. Ellen came out of the Calloway house already dressed and ready, which Seth appreciated because he had half expected to wait. She moved quickly and efficiently in everything she did. He was already noticing, as if she had calculated the cost of unnecessary time and found it too high. She mounted Penny with competence and they rode east together in the morning light, the horses walking easy. For the first mile or so they did not talk much, which Seth found was not uncomfortable the way silence usually is with a stranger, but rather the kind of quiet that is simply 2 people thinking in the same direction at the same time. "How long have you had your claim?" she asked. 5 years, he said. "I proved it up 2 years ago. I own it outright now." "Do you do well?" He liked that she asked directly instead of approaching it sideways. "Well enough," he said. "I have 60 head of cattle. I plan to have 100 by next spring if the winter is kind." "Are the winters hard here?" "Some years harder than others. You will need to be prepared for both kinds." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the landscape around them. "I can do this," she said, and it was clear from her tone that she was not asking for his opinion on the matter. "I believe you," he said. She looked at him sideways. "You say that very easily for a man who has known me for 5 minutes. I say it because you drove a wagon alone from Missouri to Texas, and you asked for directions like it was nothing," he said. "A woman who does that is not going to let a Texas winter stop her." Something that was nearly a smile moved across her face. It happened quickly, the way light moves across water. "Fair enough," she said. They arrived at the claim, and he showed her the creek and the building site, and walked the boundary lines with her, explaining the landmarks that corresponded with the survey documents she carried. She listened and asked sharp, useful questions and made notes in a small book she pulled from her coat pocket. He told her about the water table and the grass cycles, and the fact that the ridge to the north broke the worst of the blue northers when they came down in January. He told her which part of the land flooded in a wet spring and which part would be most productive for a kitchen garden. He did not tell her about the cottonwood tree. He was not ready to tell her about the cottonwood tree. They stood at the western boundary of her claim at mid-morning, and he could see his own land from there, and the tall shape of the cottonwood against the pale sky, and the letters carved into it that he had pressed his fingers against a dozen times now. "What is that tree?" she asked, following his gaze. "Cottonwood," he said. "I planted it 5 years ago. It is on my property just over the line." She looked at it and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, in a different kind of voice, quieter, "James wrote to me about a cottonwood tree. He said in his last letter that there was a beautiful cottonwood on the eastern edge of the neighboring claim, and that when he sat at the creek in the evenings he could see it from where he sat." She stopped. "I am sorry. That was a strange thing to say." "No," Seth said. "It was not." She looked at him, and whatever she saw in his expression made her hold his gaze for a moment longer than she might have otherwise. Then she turned back to the tree, and something passed across her face that he could not name, something soft and complicated. "I am going to build a home here," she said quietly. "I owe it to James." "You owe it to yourself," Seth said. She turned and looked at him again with those dark eyes and said nothing, and the wind moved between them and ruffled the grass. The weeks that followed were the busiest of Seth's recent memory, and not all of it was because of his own work. He found himself over at the Atwood claim more than was strictly necessary, more than could be fully explained by neighborly duty, and he found that he had very little desire to explain it even to himself. He helped her shore up the dugout structure for the winter, because she could not begin building a proper house until spring, and she needed somewhere to shelter in the meantime that was not the Callaway House Hotel, which was costing her money she did not have in great supply. James had left her some savings and the claim itself, but savings went quickly on the frontier. They worked side by side with timber and sod, and he was continually surprised by the amount of work she could do, not because he had underestimated her, but because she consistently exceeded the estimates you might make even after revising them upward. She was also, he discovered, funny in a dry and understated way that crept up on you. She would say something completely matter-of-fact, and it would take him half a beat to realize it was a joke, and then he would laugh, and she would look at him with a satisfaction that was almost imperious. She told him about growing up in Missouri, near Columbia, the daughter of a schoolteacher father and a mother who had died when Ellen was 15. She had helped raise her younger sister while her brother James worked and saved. When James had headed west, she had thought about going with him but had stayed for her sister, who was now married and settled. Then James's letters had stopped coming and the formal notification had arrived, and Ellen had packed what she owned into a wagon and come west because James had believed in this land, and because she had no particular reason to stay in Missouri, and every reason to honor what her brother had worked toward. "Were you not afraid?" Seth asked one evening. They were sitting outside the dugout in the last of the autumn light, drinking coffee from tin cups, and the sky was going pink and gold and vast overhead the way the Texas sky did at sunset, like it was showing off. "Afraid of what?" she asked. "Coming alone, the road, all of it." She thought about it honestly. "I was afraid of arriving and finding nothing worth the trip," she said. "I was afraid James had been wrong about the land and I would get here and it would be bleak and I would have traded everything for a mistake." She looked out at the creek, at the amber grass and the pale sky. "But the land is good." He was right. "He was right," Seth agreed. She looked at him. In the fading light, her face was all warm shadow and gold edges, and he felt something open up in his chest that he had been keeping closed for a long time, not out of sorrow, but simply out of the lack of anything that required it to open. "You have been very kind to me," she said. "You did not have to be." "I wanted to be," he said, which was truer than anything he had said in a long time. She held his gaze for a moment and then looked back at the sky, and neither of them said anything else, and the silence was the good kind, the kind that holds things rather than letting them escape. December came in cold and honest, and Ellen moved into the dugout, which was far from comfortable but was dry and warm enough with the iron stove Seth had helped her install. He rode over nearly every other day to check that the stove was drawing properly and that she had enough firewood, and she received his visits with the matter-of-fact ease of someone who had decided to accept help without making a production of it either way. Gideon observed all of this with the quiet attention of a man who sees things clearly and chooses his moments carefully. "You like her," Gideon said one day in December when they were mending Seth's north fence together in the cold. "She is a good neighbor," Seth said. "You have ridden over there 7 times in the last 2 weeks. The stove needed attention." "Seth, what?" Gideon looked at him with the dark eyes that did not miss much. "I am just saying." "What are you saying?" "I am saying that you planted that tree in 1868 and her initials are carved into it, and she showed up and moved in next door, and you ride over there 7 times in 2 weeks, Gideon said. "I'm not saying anything supernatural. I'm just saying that sometimes things line up in ways that are interesting." Seth was quiet for a long moment, working the wire. "Her brother carved those initials," he said. "That is the most logical explanation." "Probably," Gideon agreed. "But does it matter which one carved them as long as you feel what you feel?" Seth had no answer for that, and Gideon did not push him for one. Christmas came to Callaway Creek with the determination that small towns bring to holidays, which is to say thoroughly and communally. There was a gathering at the schoolhouse with a tree brought in from 20 miles east where the timber was thicker, and there was singing and food, and the particular warmth of people who live in a hard place, choosing to celebrate being alive. Ellen came to the Christmas gathering at Seth's invitation, or rather she said she had been planning to go anyway when he mentioned it, which was her way of accepting an invitation without making it into a thing. They sat together in the schoolhouse, and she sang the hymns with a clear, unself-conscious voice, and he watched her from the corner of his eye, and felt that open feeling in his chest growing broader and warmer with each passing hour, until it was less like a feeling and more like a fact. After the gathering, he walked her back to her wagon in the cold, clear night, and the stars were out in that overwhelming West Texas way, the Milky Way thrown across the sky like a bright cloth. "It is beautiful," she said, looking up. "It is," he agreed, not looking at the sky. She looked at him and caught him looking, and he did not look away because there did not seem to be a reason to. "Seth," she said quietly. "Ellen," he said. The name sat between them in the cold air, simple and warm. "Thank you for this," she said. "For all of it. You have made this less lonely than it might have been." "It has not been a sacrifice," he said. "Being around you is the best part of my days lately." She blinked. A very small thing, that blink, but he noticed it because he was paying attention to everything about her now with the helpless exactness of a man falling. "That is a considerable thing to say," she said. "It is a considerable thing to mean," he said. She was quiet for a moment, looking at him in the starlight. "I have not made any decisions about the nature of this," she said carefully. "I'm here to build something. I'm not here to be swept into anything before I have found my footing." "I understand," he said. "I'm not trying to sweep you into anything. I'm just telling you the truth because it seemed like the honest thing to do." She looked at him for a moment longer, and then a smile came onto her face, real and warm and unhurried. "You are a very straightforward man, Seth Rhodes." "I try to be," he said. "I appreciate it," she said. And then she climbed up onto her wagon bench and drove away down the road in the cold, bright night. And he stood watching until the sound of her wheels faded, and then he stood watching the dark for a while longer. January came in the way January always does in the Texas Panhandle, which is without mercy or apology. The blue northers came down hard, the temperature dropping 40 degrees in 2 hours with a wind that got inside your clothes and argued with your bones about whose land this really was. Seth battened down his own house and then rode through the driving cold to Ellen's claim to make sure she was prepared, and found her already battened down, the dugout sealed against the wind with the stove glowing hot, and a supply of wood that was adequate but not generous. He brought her more wood. He brought it in 3 loads on his wagon, which was unnecessary but felt necessary, and she thanked him with the practical directness that was her manner and did not make a fuss about it. They spent the worst of that January blue norther together in the dugout, waiting out the worst of the wind. She made coffee and he stoked the stove, and outside the wind was doing things to the land that sounded biblical. And inside it was small and warm, and they sat across from each other at her small table and talked in the easy way of people who have found that they fit together in conversation the way good-made things fit together, without forcing. She told him about learning to read from her father and how she had read everything she could find in their small Missouri town and then started over and read it all again. She told him about the time she had climbed onto the schoolhouse roof on a dare from James and had not been afraid until she was already up there, and then had been very afraid indeed but too stubborn to show it. She told him about her mother, who had played the piano with such feeling that people from 2 streets over could hear it, and how after she died the house had been quieter in a way that was not about sound. He told her things he had not told many people. He told her about growing up in Kentucky with a father who was kind but distant, the way men of that generation were, who showed love by providing and could not find the language for anything softer. He told her about coming west after the war, not because he had fought but because the country felt different afterward, lighter in some places and heavier in others, and west was where the lighter feeling seemed to be. He told her about planting the cottonwood tree the first spring he was here, and how he had needed something living to watch grow. "Why a cottonwood?" she asked. "They grow fast," he said. "When you are starting from nothing you want to see progress." She smiled. "And you watch it, you check on it." "Every morning," he admitted. She looked at him with something warm in her eyes. "I think that is wonderful," she said, and the way she said it was not sentimental but simply honest, and that honesty landed somewhere deep in him. He did not tell her about the initials. Not yet. He was still turning it over, still deciding how to say it, because it seemed like something that needed to be said carefully or not at all. The storm broke on the second day, and they emerged into a world that was white-edged and scoured clean, the sky painfully blue and the air brilliant and still. The creek had a thin skin of ice along its edges, and the grass was frost-stiff and sparkling, and everything looked like it had been remade. They stood outside the dugout and looked at it. "Beautiful," she said. "Every storm does that," he said. "Cleans everything out and shows you what is underneath." She looked at him with a sideways expression that was almost shy, which was not a word he would have usually applied to her, but there it was. "Like honesty," she said. "Something like that," he agreed. In February she told him that she was going to need more help than she had initially calculated to build the house before summer. The dugout was adequate for winter but would be miserable in the July heat, and she needed a proper structure. She had the money for materials if she was careful, but the labor was beyond what she could do alone in the time available. She said this plainly sitting across from him at her table, no performance of helplessness, just a statement of logistics. "I will build it with you," he said. "I cannot pay you. I know, Seth, I cannot accept that as charity." "It is not charity," he said. "It is one neighbor helping another. Gideon helped me build half my house. I helped him finish his barn. That is how things work out here." She looked at him. "Is that really how things work out here, or is that how you are choosing to frame this particular situation?" He looked back at her with complete equanimity. "Both," he said. She pressed her lips together in a way that was trying not to smile and failing. "All right," she said. "But I will feed you every evening while we work." "That is an excellent arrangement," he said. They started building in March when the ground softened enough to work. Gideon came too, as Seth had known he would, and the 3 of them worked through the cool spring days cutting timber that Seth had arranged to have hauled from the east and laying a proper foundation and raising walls. Ellen worked alongside them, not as a supervisor but as a laborer, learning what she did not know with the focused intensity of someone who does not have the luxury of ignorance. She learned to drive nails and set beams and chinked gaps with a precision that impressed Gideon enough to say so out loud, which was considerable because Gideon said very little out loud. In the evenings Ellen cooked supper on the dugout stove, And the food was good, plain frontier cooking, but done with care. And they ate together in the warmth of the small space and talked until the dark came full outside. Gideon often rode back to his own place after supper, but sometimes he stayed and played cards with them, a three-handed game of pitch that Ellen had learned from her father, and at which she was unexpectedly ruthless, winning most hands with an expression of complete innocence. "She is cheating," Gideon told Seth in a low voice on one of these evenings. "I am absolutely not cheating," Ellen said without looking up from her cards. "I am simply better at this than either of you." "How could she possibly have heard that?" Gideon muttered. "I have very good ears," Ellen said, and laid down her winning hand. Seth was laughing before she finished speaking, laughing the way he had not in years, the kind of laughter that comes from deep in the chest and means something. It was in March, on one of those clear, warming evenings when spring was just beginning to make its promises felt in the air, that he finally told her about the initials. They were walking the boundary of her land in the late afternoon light, the way they sometimes did, talking about the spring work and what she needed to accomplish before summer. They came to the western edge of her claim, and the cottonwood tree was there, as it always was, tall and green-budded now with the first of spring, its branches beginning to fill out against the blue sky. Seth stopped walking and looked at the tree for a moment, and she stopped beside him. "Ellen," he said, "there is something I have been meaning to tell you." She turned to look at him, reading something in his voice. "All right," she said quietly. He walked to the cottonwood and turned so that the light caught the eastern face of the trunk, the way it had that first October morning, and pointed to the carved letters. "I found these in October," he said, "just before you arrived." She came closer and looked at where he was pointing. She went very still. He watched her face. He watched the color change in her cheeks and the way her breath came differently and the way her hands came up and touched the bark around the carvings, her fingertips in the grooves. She said. Her voice was strange, very low. "I have been trying to understand it," Seth said. "I planted this tree in 1868. I put the sapling in the ground myself. No one else was here, but these letters are old. The bark grew around them." He paused. "I thought it might have been your brother. He knew this land. He might have been here." She was quiet for a long moment, her hands on the bark. Then she said, "James could not have carved these." "How do you know?" She turned and looked at him, and her eyes were bright in a way that was close to tears but was not quite. "Because James's middle name was Aaron. His initials were JAA when he marked things, when he carved his name into things. He always used JA." She looked back at the tree. "EA are my initials. Ellen Atwood." She said it very quietly. "And I have never been to Texas before in my life." The silence that followed was the loudest Seth could remember hearing. "I know," he said. "That is why I did not know how to tell you." She pressed her palm flat against the bark, against the carved letters, and she stood like that for a long moment with the spring wind moving her hair and the late light gold around her and the budding cottonwood reaching up into the sky above them both. "When you planted this tree," she said slowly, "where were you? I mean, what were you doing? What was your life like?" "I had just arrived," he said. "I had claimed the land the month before. I was 22 years old and I had very little. I planted the tree because I needed something to mark this as a place I intended to stay. And you had never heard my name. You did not know I existed." "No," he said. She turned and looked at him, and the expression on her face was something he had never seen before on any face, a kind of astonishment that was not frightened but was very open, as if she had turned a corner expecting a wall and found instead a wide country. "My grandmother used to say," Ellen said softly, "that some things are written before the people who need to find them have been given the pen." She shook her head slowly. "I do not know what to make of this, Seth." "Neither do I," he said. "But I have been thinking about it for 5 months, and I have come to believe that it does not need to be made sense of. Not all of it." He paused. "What I do know is that in the 5 months since you arrived I have been happier than I have been in a long time. And I think about you constantly in a way that has nothing to do with mystery and everything to do with who you are." He stopped. His heart was going hard in his chest. "I love you, Ellen. I did not plan to say it yet." But standing here at this tree, I think it would be dishonest not to." She looked at him for a long moment. The wind moved the branches above them, and the last of the afternoon light fell between them in long gold bars. "Seth," she said, and then she stopped, and then she said, "I have been trying to be careful. I came here to build something. I was afraid of being foolish." "You are the least foolish person I know," he said. She laughed, a small surprised sound, and then her face did something that undid him entirely, opened completely into something soft and certain and unguarded. "I love you too," she said. "I have been arguing with myself about it for months." She looked at the tree. "But maybe I was always going to." He reached out and took her hand, which was warm and small and certain in his, and she looked down at their joined hands and then up at him and smiled the full smile, the one he had been catching the edges of for months, the whole extraordinary thing. He kissed her there at the base of the cottonwood tree, gently and then less gently, and her free hand came up and pressed against his chest, and she kissed him back like she had decided to, and decisions once made were not reconsidered. Above them the cottonwood moved in the spring breeze, and the carved letters in its bark held the two initials that had been waiting there in the growing wood for 5 years, patient as anything alive must be, patient as the land itself. Spring moved forward with the kind of purpose that the Texas panhandle brings to the season, as if it is making up for the time lost to winter. The house went up in April, Gideon and Seth and Ellen working with a will, and by the end of the month it had walls and a roof and real windows, 2 of them, one looking east toward the creek and one looking west toward Seth's land, and the cottonwood tree visible at the property line. When Ellen stood at the western window for the first time and saw the tree framed there, she put her hand on the glass and did not say anything, but Seth saw her face. She moved into the house in the first week of May. It was not finished in all its details, but it was solid and weather-tight and more than adequate, and she was so pleased with it that she stood in the main room on the day she moved in and turned around slowly with her arms slightly out from her sides like she was feeling the space of it. "It is mine," she said. There was a quality in her voice that Seth recognized as something very private being spoken aloud. "It is yours," he agreed. She looked at him and her eyes were bright again. "And it is good, Seth. It is genuinely good." "It is," he said, and meant every possible meaning of the words. That spring and summer were among the finest Seth could recall in Texas. The rains came regularly, not too much and not too little, which was the kind of miracle that the frontier did not reliably offer. Ellen's first kitchen garden went in and thrived. Her cattle, a small herd of 15 that she had purchased with careful deliberation from a rancher 3 counties east, settled on the creekside grass and did well. She learned the rhythms of the land with a quickness that came from the combination of intelligence and sheer will, asking Seth and Gideon questions, and then doing exactly what the answers suggested, without the hesitation that sometimes sits between knowledge and action. Seth and Ellen moved through that summer in the way of 2 people who have admitted to each other what they feel, and are now in the long, sweet process of learning the full shape of it. He came to her place in the mornings, and she came to his in the evenings, and the 4 miles between their claims felt like nothing at all when you were accustomed to thinking of them as the distance between yourself and where you wanted to be. They talked about everything. They argued about some things. Ellen had opinions and she expressed them directly, and Seth had learned that the best thing to do with a direct opinion was to meet it directly, either agreeing or disagreeing on the merits, and that this was actually more comfortable than the alternative, which he had observed in other people's marriages and which looked exhausting. They argued about the best way to treat a fence post against rot, and about whether Daniel Webster had been a great man or a compromised one, and about the right amount of salt in cornbread. These were not serious arguments. They were the arguments of 2 people finding out where the edges are and enjoying the finding. They also sat together on summer evenings with the whole sky going dark above them and talked about the quieter things, the things that do not get said unless the time is right. Ellen talked about James more freely now, about her grief and her guilt that she had not come west sooner and her certainty that she could not have known, and Seth listened the way she had taught him to listen, which was without rushing to fix or reassure, simply holding the space open. He talked to her about his father, who had died the winter before Seth came west, and about the incomplete quality of a grief that is mixed with things unsaid. Ellen listened the way he had come to know was her listening, completely and without agenda. By July, Gideon had stopped pretending not to notice and had simply started treating Ellen as a fixture in their arrangement, the way you stop noticing the furniture once you have accepted that it belongs there. He called her by her first name, and she called him Gideon, and they had developed a comfortable rapport based largely on their shared assessment of Seth's habit of underestimating how long things would take. "He told me we would have the north pasture fence finished by Thursday," Ellen told Gideon one evening with the air of someone presenting evidence. "When did he tell you Thursday?" "Monday." "And what day is it now?" "Saturday." Gideon looked at Seth with the expression of a judge who has been presented with a clear verdict. "I have known him for 4 years," he said. "Everything he builds takes twice as long as he says it will. I underestimate by enthusiasm, not by laziness," Seth said with dignity. "That does not make the fence finished," Ellen said, and they both laughed at him, and he laughed too, because it was true, and because their laughing together was one of the best sounds he had access to. In August, Seth asked her to marry him. He had thought carefully about how to do it. He was not a man for elaborate gestures, and he did not think she was a woman who wanted them, but this deserved more than a casual mention over supper. He rode over to her place on a Sunday morning when the light was clear, and the air had the particular quality of a late summer morning that has not yet become hot, and he asked her to walk with him to the cottonwood tree. She went with him across the dry grass and the short scrub, the two of them walking in easy silence the way they had come to walk together, shoulders sometimes close enough to touch. At the tree he stopped and turned to face her, and she looked at his face and then looked at the tree and then looked at him again, and he could see from her eyes that she already knew what was coming and had a feeling about it. He had brought a small ring that had been his mother's, a simple gold band with a tiny blue stone set into it, and he held it between his fingers in the morning light. "I want to build my life with you," he said. "Not just next door. I want it to be one life. I know you came here to stand on your own land, and I respect that with everything in me. Your land is yours. It will always be yours. That is not what I am asking you to give up. I am asking you to give up the part where we say good night and you ride 4 miles east and I ride 4 miles west when we both know we want the same thing." He stopped. "Ellen Atwood, will you marry me?" She stood in front of him with the cottonwood behind her, and the blue sky above and the wind in her hair and her dark eyes on his face, and she did not make him wait. "Yes," she said. "I have been waiting for you to ask me for 2 months." He laughed out loud, the astonished laugh of a man who has been told something that delights and mortifies him simultaneously. 2 months, approximately," she said, with the smile that undid him. "Why did you not say something?" "Because you were supposed to ask," she said simply, "and I knew you would." He slid the ring onto her finger and she looked at it and then up at him, and he kissed her there at the tree again, the way he had in the spring, but differently now, the way things are different when they have moved from possibility to certainty. They married in October, 1 year almost exactly after Ellen had arrived in Callaway Creek. The ceremony was at the schoolhouse, performed by the circuit minister who came through every 6 weeks, and the whole town came because Callaway Creek was the size it was, and also because Seth Rhodes and Ellen Atwood had between them, in their time there, made enough of themselves that people were genuinely glad for them. Ellen wore a blue dress the color of a high October sky that she had sewn herself in the evenings over the previous month, and she wore Seth's mother's ring, and she walked up to the front of the room on her own 2 feet, because there was no one to give her away, and she had told Seth that she was perfectly capable of giving herself. Seth wore his good coat and a new shirt and had his hat in his hands, and when she came through the door of the schoolhouse and he saw her properly, he felt the world do something quiet and definitive. the way the world sometimes does when it clicks into an arrangement it has been working toward. The minister said the words, and they said their own words to each other. Simple ones, because the important things generally are. And when the minister pronounced them, married, the schoolhouse rang with the cheering of Callaway Creek, and Gideon in the front row was smiling the broad, easy smile of a man whose patience in waiting for the obvious to happen has finally been rewarded. Afterward there was food and music. A fiddler named Burl who could play everything from hymns to reels and generally played both at the same time, and dancing in the cleared space of the schoolroom, and Seth danced with his wife, and the word wife was the most extraordinary word he had ever been entitled to say. "Are you happy?" she asked him while they were dancing, her voice low enough that it was only for him. "Ellen," he said, "I am so happy I do not entirely know what to do with it." She pressed her forehead briefly against his shoulder and then lifted it and looked at him with shining eyes. "Good," she said, "because so am I." They went home together that night to his house, to their house now, because they had decided that her house would remain hers to use for her own purposes and the cattle operation, but that the home would be his place, which was larger and more finished, and they would add to it. Ellen's house became a working house, storage and an extra shelter, and it stood on her claim and was hers in law and in fact, and that arrangement satisfied her completely. Custer the hound dog received Ellen with the dignified acceptance of an old friend, confirming a long-held suspicion. He put his large head on her knee the first evening she sat in the house as its permanent resident and looked up at her with his brown eyes, and she scratched his ears without hesitation. "He likes me," she said. "He has always liked you," Seth said. "He told me so months ago." She looked up from the dog with an amused expression. "Is that so?" "He is very communicative," Seth said seriously. She laughed and Custer wagged his tail, and it was the beginning of their household, which was from that night forward a household of two, and a dog, and later considerably more. The first winter of their marriage was the kind of winter that tests things, which is to say it was hard. Cold came early and stayed long, and there were losses in the cattle herd, inevitable losses that Seth had prepared for financially, but that Ellen took with the particular grief of a woman who had watched every one of her animals through the season with care. She did not fall apart over the losses, but she went quiet for a few days after the worst of the cold, sitting by the fire in the evenings with her hands in her lap, and Seth understood that quiet the way he understood her, which by now was fairly well. He sat beside her and did not rush her, and one evening she said, "I keep thinking about James, how hard he worked and how little time he had." She was quiet. "I want to do it right. I want the land to be what he believed it would be." "It will be," Seth said. "This is one winter. We will recover what we lost." She turned and looked at him, and her expression was the one that she wore when she was about to say something from the center of herself. "We," she said quietly. "We," he confirmed. She put her hand over his, and that was all either of them needed to say. Spring came as it always did, as a reminder that the harsh things are not the permanent things, and the land renewed itself with the stubborn faith of a place that has been through worse. Ellen recovered her herd losses with a purchase. She negotiated herself from a rancher to the south, arguing him down on price with a calm persistence that left him looking slightly dazed but not unhappy, and by April her operation was larger than it had been before the winter losses. Seth expanded his own herd. They worked the land together and hired on a young hand named Pete Dougherty, who was 17 and new from Kansas, and who was earnest and willing and learned fast. Pete lived in the bunkroom Seth added to the back of the house that spring and was so grateful to have steady work and decent meals that he would have moved mountains if asked, though Ellen generally only asked him to move fence posts, which he did with equal enthusiasm. Ellen was expecting their first child by summer. She told Seth on a May morning in the kitchen, with the practicality she brought to everything, sitting across from him at breakfast, and saying that he should know that by winter they would need the extra room they had talked about adding. It took him a full 10 seconds to understand what she meant, and when he did, He sat very still for a moment in the way he had stood still at the cottonwood tree the year he found the initials, with the same quality of stillness that is not absence of feeling but is the complete saturation of it. "Ellen," he said. "We should start on the room soon," she said, watching him with warm eyes. "Before I am too large to be useful with a hammer." He got up from the table and came around to where she sat and crouched down in front of her and took both her hands in both of his. And she looked at him with that full smile, the whole of it, and he said, "Are you well? Are you feeling well?" "I am perfectly well," she said. "I am happy and healthy, and there is a child coming, and I need you to not look at me like I am made of glass, or I will have to remind you that I drove a wagon from Missouri to Texas by myself." He laughed and she laughed, and he pressed his face briefly against their joined hands, because there was no more adequate response to the moment. They added the room through June and July, Seth and Pete and Gideon working on it in the long summer evenings, and it was finished by August with a proper floor and a real window and space enough. Ellen set up the cradle that Clara Perkins brought over as a gift, an old one that Clara said had been waiting in her house for a new purpose, and she put it in the new room and stood back and looked at it with an expression that Seth was not ashamed to say made his eyes sting. The baby came in November, a healthy boy with Seth's jaw and Ellen's eyes, born with the assistance of Doc Perkins on a cold, clear night with the stars out, and Custer sitting outside the bedroom door with an expression of intense personal concern. They named him James. James Rhodes, for the man who had come west first and believed in the land and written letters home about a cottonwood tree on the neighboring claim that was beautiful in the evenings. Seth held his son for the first time in the lamplight of the new room while Ellen rested and Gideon and Pete waited in the main room with their hats in their hands, and the baby was small and warm and alarmingly present, the most solid and real thing he had ever held, and he could not have said a word to save his life in that moment. He could only look at the small face and be entirely overcome. Ellen was watching him from the bed with tired and luminous eyes. "Say something," she said softly. "I cannot," he said. "Try." He looked up from the baby to his wife and back to his son, and he said, "He is perfect. You are extraordinary. I have been the luckiest man in Texas since the day you drove your wagon into town." "That," Ellen said with her eyes closing, "will do very nicely." James Rhodes was a fine baby who grew into a lively toddler and kept them both extremely busy in the way that small children do, by being simultaneously delightful and catastrophic. He learned to walk at 9 months with an enthusiasm that far exceeded his coordination, and he developed a deep personal affiliation with the hound dog Custer, who submitted to being used as a pillow and a pull-up handle and a conversational partner with a patience that Seth found genuinely moving. The years moved forward. They were not always easy years, because the frontier was not an easy life and never pretended to be, and there were hard seasons and difficult losses, and once, in 1877, a spring flood that took out 3 miles of their fence and a portion of the creek bank and required 2 weeks of brutal work to address. But the hard things were surrounded by the good things, and the good things were substantial. Gideon Hall fell in love in 1876 with a woman named Ada who came to Callaway Creek to teach in the schoolhouse, a small, precise woman from Ohio with red hair and strong opinions about education. And Ellen was so delighted by this development that she organized a dinner at their house, specifically to encourage it, and invited Gideon and Ada, without telling either of them that the other had been invited. Gideon arrived first and stood in the kitchen doorway in his good clothes looking betrayed, and Ellen looked at him with complete serenity. "You have been kind to me," she said. "I am returning the favor." "Ellen, I did not ask for this," Gideon said. "The best things are never asked for," Ellen said, and went back to stirring the pot. Ada arrived 6 minutes later, and Gideon turned from the window where he had been attempting to look casual, and they looked at each other. And within the hour they were deep in a conversation about the Kansas school system that excluded everyone else in the room. And Seth caught Ellen's eye across the table, and she smiled at him with the satisfied expression of someone who has played cards well. Gideon and Ada were married the following spring, and Ellen made the wedding supper and cried at the ceremony with the honesty of a woman who feels things fully and does not apologize for it. By 1878, the homestead was a different thing than the land Seth had claimed in 1868. The house had 4 rooms now and a covered porch where Ellen spent her evenings reading when the weather was good. The cattle operation had grown to combined holdings of 240 head between Seth's herd and Ellen's, managed together with Pete Doherty, who had grown into a reliable and indispensable foreman. The land was fenced and watered and productive, and the kitchen garden that Ellen had planted every spring since her first year had expanded into something that supplied them through the winter, and then some. James Rhodes was 4 years old and interested in everything, with his mother's quickness and his father's stubbornness, a combination that produced a child who was simultaneously a joy and a genuine challenge. He had recently discovered the cottonwood tree and had appointed himself its guardian, which primarily expressed itself in chasing off the crows that landed in it, with a seriousness about this task that both his parents found difficult to address without laughing. Seth took James to the tree one evening in the early spring of 1878, when the boy was old enough to be told things and young enough to receive them without too much analysis. He lifted James up and showed him the carved letters, the EA that the bark had grown around over the 10 years since Seth had planted the sapling. "Those are letters," James said with authority. He was deeply proud of his recent acquisition of the alphabet. "They are," Seth said. "E and A, EA," James said. "Mama." "Yes," Seth said, "Mama's initials." James regarded the carvings with 4-year-old gravity. "Why are Mama's letters in the tree?" "That," Seth said, "is a very good question." He carried his son back to the house where Ellen was on the porch with her book in the last of the daylight, and he told James to go and ask his mother to explain the letters in the tree. And James ran up onto the porch and climbed into Ellen's lap and demanded this explanation with the directness of a child who has been raised by 2 very direct people. Ellen looked across the yard at Seth where he stood leaning against the fence post, and her eyes were warm and knowing, and she shook her head slightly. "A very good question," she said, to the boy and to Seth and to the evening. Then she looked at her son's dark eyes, which were so like her own, and she said, "When your father planted that tree, he was planting a place to stay, and the tree kept his intention, and when I came to this land it recognized me because I was always supposed to be here." James considered this with the focused gravity of a 4-year-old. "Because you belong here." "Because I belong here," she confirmed, and looked at Seth over the boy's head with the full smile, the one that had not changed in the years she had worn it. Seth came up onto the porch and sat beside her on the bench, and James sprawled across both of them in the comfortable way of small children who have not yet learned that lap space is finite. And the evening came down warm and blue and full of cricket sound and the smell of spring, and the cottonwood stood at the edge of the property with its letters in its bark, and its branches bright with new leaves reaching up into the darkening sky. The years that came after were full ones. Ellen had a second child in 1879, another boy they named Robert, who arrived in the July heat with considerably less ceremony than James had, and immediately demonstrated a placid and cheerful nature that was distinct from his brother's in every way, as if he had assessed the family temperament and decided to provide balance. James was 6 and received his brother with suspicion that converted within 3 days to proprietary affection, appointing himself Robert's guide to the world with a thoroughness that Robert, as soon as he was capable of an opinion, seemed to find unnecessary but bore with the philosophical patience that would characterize him all his life. Pete Doherty married a woman from a neighboring county in 1880, a steady and capable woman named Ruth, and they built a small house on the western edge of the Rhodes land with Seth's blessing and Pete's expanding stake in the operation. Callaway Creek had grown by then. the way towns grew in Texas in the 1870s and 1880s, adding a dry goods store and a second doctor, and a small newspaper that appeared every week with the determined cheerfulness of a frontier paper that understood its job, was as much morale as news. Ellen became involved with the schoolhouse in a way that was entirely predictable to anyone who knew her. Starting as a helper and becoming within 2 years effectively the organizing force behind the school's expansion from 1 room to 2, and the acquisition of a full year's curriculum of proper textbooks that she had written away to a publisher in St. Louis, and had negotiated a reduced price for on the grounds that educating the children of the frontier was a public good and the publisher ought to treat it accordingly. The publisher, whoever they were, had apparently agreed, because the books arrived. Seth watched his wife move through her life the way he had watched the cottonwood tree grow, with the feeling of something unfolding into what it was always meant to be. She was not someone who became smaller as years passed. She became larger, more fully herself, more grounded in the land and the work and the community she had helped build. She had opinions about the cattle operation and about town politics and about the curriculum in the schoolhouse and about the way to tell a story and about the right length of a sermon, which she had once delivered directly to the minister visiting for Sunday service with a candor that had left him blinking, and the congregation trying very hard not to laugh. She was the person Seth turned to at the end of every day, not because he needed to, not from weakness, but because she was where his understanding of things became clearer. She was the person he thought of when he heard something worth saying. She was, in the plainest possible terms, the person without whom the shape of his life would have been lesser. He told her this on their 5th wedding anniversary in October of 1878, sitting on the porch with the cottonwood visible in the evening, and she turned and looked at him and said, "You are the person I would choose again. If I had to do it all over, I would choose you every time." "Starting from the beginning," he said. "From Missouri." "Starting from wherever it started," she said, and looked at the tree. "Maybe before." He reached out and took her hand, and they sat in the evening quiet, the sounds of their boys inside the house, and the soft noise of the horses in the corral and the wind in the cottonwood. And Seth Rhodes thought about the man he had been at 22, planting a sapling in the Texas dirt with no particular reason to expect anything extraordinary, and about the woman sitting beside him with her initials in the bark of a tree that had been growing toward her all along. In 1882, the cottonwood was 14 years old and tall and broad-canopied, and it was the kind of tree that people notice, the kind you can see from a distance and use as a landmark. The bark had thickened and grooved deeply over the years, and the carved letters were there still, lower on the trunk than they once seemed, because the tree had grown around them, incorporating them, making them part of itself. The letters were Seth's now as much as they were Ellen's, which was not a metaphor but a fact, the way all things on that land were both of theirs in ways that did not diminish either of them. James was 9 and Robert was 3, and both of them were present in the landscape of that land, the way trees are present, growing and reaching and altering the character of the place simply by being in it. On a clear October morning that year, 10 years to the month after Ellen had driven her wagon into Callaway Creek, Seth walked his usual morning perimeter with his coffee in his left hand and Custer walking beside him, older now but still committed, still with his ears up in the morning air. They stopped at the cottonwood, and Seth stood there as he had 1,000 times since the first morning he had found the letters, and he looked at them. E.A. Ellen Atwood. Ellen Atwood Rhodes. He pressed his hand to the bark, as he had on that first morning, and he stood in the October light and thought about everything that had come from this tree, this small sapling he had carried in a flour sack from the town of Haskell, because he had needed something living to grow on the land where he intended to stay. He heard the screen door of the house open and close, and the sound of boots on the porch steps and across the dry grass, and he did not turn around because he knew the sound of her walking toward him the way he knew his own heartbeat. She came and stood beside him and looked at the tree and at the letters in the bark. She had a second cup of coffee and she put it in his empty hand because she had noticed, the way she always noticed things, that he had finished his first. He wrapped his fingers around the warm tin. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning," he said. They stood together in the October light with the land spreading out around them. Their land, their cattle in the pasture and their horses in the corral and their children still asleep in the house behind them. And the cottonwood tree with its carved letters stood in the morning as it had always stood, patient and certain. The way living things are certain, rooted in the ground and reaching for the sky. "I was thinking," Ellen said in the voice she used for thoughts that had been turning a while. "Tell me," he said. "I was thinking that James is old enough to understand the whole story now, the real whole of it, the sapling and the letters and how long you had been here and why they are there." She paused. "I think he should know. Both of them should eventually. Robert when he is older." Seth nodded slowly. "What would you say about how the letters came to be there?" She was quiet for a moment. The wind moved in the cottonwood above them, and a few amber leaves came loose and fell around them in the morning light. "I would say," she said finally, "that some things are written in living things before the story is ready to begin. I would say that the land was patient, and the tree was patient, and so were we, even before we knew we were waiting." She looked at him with her dark eyes. "I would say that this is a love story that started in a flour sack and a hole in the ground and 5 years of good rain, and one morning when your father went walking and found something that did not make sense and did not let go of it." Seth looked at the letters in the bark and then at his wife. "And they will want to know if it is true," he said. "It is true," she said, "even the part that does not make sense." She smiled at him, the full smile. "Especially that part," she said. He kissed her at the base of the cottonwood tree the way he had kissed her on the day she had said yes, the way he had kissed her on their wedding day and on every significant morning in the years between. And she kissed him back with the warmth and certainty of a woman who had meant what she said about choosing him again. Behind them the house was waking up. They could hear James's footsteps crossing the floor, quick and deliberate, and Robert's smaller sounds. And the screen door would open soon, and the boys would come looking for them, the way boys come looking for parents in the morning, at full speed and with no particular concern for what they might be interrupting. "We should go in," Ellen said against his shoulder. "In a minute," he said, and she did not argue. They stood one more minute at the cottonwood tree, the two of them in the October morning, with 10 years of love and land and life behind them, and all the years ahead still unwritten, still open as the Texas sky that stretched above them in every direction without a visible end. The letters in the bark held their shape, held their meaning, held the mystery that Seth had turned over in his hands and his heart since the morning he found them, and that Ellen had recognized the moment she pressed her palm to the wood. Not everything needed an explanation. Some things needed only to be true, and this was true, rooted in the ground and growing still, the way all true things grow. The screen door opened, and James came across the yard toward them at his usual speed, which was somewhere between a walk and a controlled fall, calling his father's name in the way of a boy who has important information to deliver. And behind him, Robert appeared in the doorway, blinking in the morning light with his calm dark eyes. Seth turned and opened his arms for his son, and James arrived in them at full force the way he always did. And Seth laughed and caught him and looked up at Ellen, who was watching them both with her hand shading her eyes against the morning sun, her ring catching the light, her face carrying the warmth of every season that had passed on this land. They walked back to the house together in the October morning, Seth carrying James and Ellen taking Robert's small hand at the doorstep, and behind them the cottonwood tree stood in the light with the carved letters in its bark, E.A., whole and unhurried, as it would stand for a very long time still. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.